It's now my pleasure to call on Krissy Barrett, who's the Assistant Commissioner of Counter-Terrorism and Special Investigations for the Australian Federal Police. She has held key roles such as Assistant Commissioner of Southern Command and Deputy Chief Police Officer of ACT Policing. Barrett holds a Police Overseas Service Medal and an Operations Medal for the Bali bombings. Her education focuses on policing leadership and management, as well as criminal justice. She has represented Australia at Five Eyes law enforcement working groups. Ms. Barrett, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. As just introduced, my name is Krissy Barrett and I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Counter-Terrorism and Special Investigations with the Australian Federal Police. I would first like to start by thanking the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism for providing the invitation for me to provide this address today. And I'm very honoured to be one of a number of Australian law enforcement senior executives that have spoken at this conference over the last few years. I will also apologise in advance that I have brought quite a cough with me all the way from Australia. So if I need to take a break, please bear with me. But I will get started because that very aggressive clock is looming right in front of me. So as Assistant Commissioner Counter-Terrorism and Special Investigations, I oversee a command which spans not only across Australia, but has a global reach with deployment of dedicated members all over the world. The CTSI command has a broad remit and is responsible for not only counter-terrorism, but also special investigations, which encompasses espionage and foreign interference in the AFP. October last year marked 20 years since the tragic bombing in Bali, in which 202 people were killed, including 88 Australians. The terrible impacts of the Bali bombings continue to be felt by countless people affected by the loss of loved ones during this tragic incident, as well as by the survivors who continue to live with the physical and psychological scars of the attack. The Bali bombings, along with the tragic events of September 11, were really central in reshaping Australia's overarching national security approach. The September 11 attack led to the establishment of the current counter-terrorism framework we have in Australia, and this includes the establishment of joint counter-terrorism teams, or JCTTs, where the AFP works in close partnership with our state and territory police services, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or ASIO, and other Commonwealth agencies to identify, investigate, prevent and disrupt terrorist activities in Australia. The threat of terrorism in Australia remains enduring. It's increasingly complex and diversified. In November 2022, so just last year, the Australian government lowered the national threat level from probable to possible. However, despite the lowering of the threat level, the terrorism threat remains persistent and our caseload in the AFP endures. We must remain vigilant to ensure that we protect our communities from those who continue to seek to do us harm. The aspirations of terrorist organisations and those directed or influenced by their ideology has not reduced, and the Australian community needs to be assured and can be assured that the Australian Federal Police and our partners continue to do all that we can to maintain public safety. How we adapt and how we respond to this diversified threat landscape will no doubt manifest differently in our respective regions. However, terrorism does not exist in a vacuum, we all know that, and our ability to combat extremist objectives is stronger when we work together across national boundaries and collectively with our international partners. Today I'd like to just touch on the complexity, diversification and the compounding nature of the threat actors and the threat drivers that we're seeing in the current counter-terrorism environment. These include the enduring risks of religiously motivated violent extremism, particularly with the declining security situation in Afghanistan and other malgoverned environments. The threat of domestic attacks from lone actors is ongoing and has further compounded the threat of more sophisticated attack planning emanating from Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan. Secondly, the increase in ideologically motivated violent extremism, as we are seeing the number of individuals who adhere to the various narratives, including nationalist and racist ideologies, continues to grow and spread across the country. The online environment, which has allowed violent extremists to amplify their impact, particularly during COVID-19, through the sharing of extremist propaganda and material from anywhere and everywhere in the world. We continue to respond to an increasing prevalence of youth being radicalised online, with the youngest individual being just 12 years of age. The threat of terrorist acts being committed by high-risk terrorist offenders who are released into the community after a period of incarceration. This is enduring and it will continue to increase for us in Australia. There also remains an ongoing threat of religiously motivated terrorism in our broader region, with terrorist plots from terror groups aligned to ISIS or AQ continuing to be disrupted. The AFP will continue to engage and must continue to engage with our international partners to disrupt these threats in our broader region. I'll also just briefly touch on the significance of community engagement in countering violent extremism, including the important work that we do to undertake and build meaningful relationships within our communities to ensure that people are empowered to identify but also respond when they think someone may be radicalised. With consideration of all these threat drivers, it highlights the work undertaken by the AFP, where it encompasses that whole life cycle of a terrorist offender. So starting with the identification of threats and leads, through to our joint counter-terrorism investigations, into custodial management, onto enduring risk investigations, and then finally to the management of an individual in the community following their release from custody. So in relation to Australia's response to terrorism, global and regional turmoil, political instability and conflict around the world, that all fuels the terrorism threat, and you're all very well aware of that. These events provide extremists with opportunities to exploit the concerns and vulnerabilities of groups and individuals, especially where governance and legislation is weak and security conditions allow extremism to develop. The pervasiveness of the internet has enabled a borderless environment for extremist reach. Technology today is far more advanced than ever before, enabling people to connect via new and innovative platforms that feed digital algorithms. These algorithms are contributing to the creation of echo chambers that shift technology users' patterns of exposure. The imagery and the propaganda of violent extremists in Europe or in the Middle East is accessed as easily in Australia as anywhere else in the world. Extremists are able to easily connect and engage with others, including our young people, to recruit and radicalise from the other side of the globe. Despite the focus of government and industry to implement mechanisms that prevent extremist material being easily accessible online, violent extremists are adept at subverting these efforts. Australia's experience of terrorism has been substantially focused on the ongoing threat of religiously motivated violent extremism, or RMVE, with individuals who maintain an RMVE ideology prominently aligned to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State or their affiliates. This violent extremist ideology is the primary threat driver for our existing high-risk terrorist offender cohort and those who remain offshore in the Australian Foreign Terrorist Fighters cohort. The AFP, along with ASIO, has been vocal in our concern that the threat of ideologically motivated violent extremism or IMVE is real and it is growing. The primary threat driver for our current IMVE counter-terrorism caseload is nationalist and racist violent extremism. However, we also see a broad spectrum of people with anti-government sentiment and specific issue grievances who may also radicalise to violence. Nationalist and racist violent extremists in Australia continue to espouse a narrative of hatred that is driven by white supremacy, neo-Nazi, anti-Muslim, anti-Indigenous and anti-Semitic sentiments. These individuals are connected through smaller fractious groups and or digitally connected to like-minded organisations or individuals nationally and internationally. This is reflected in Australia's listing of 3 IMVE-related terrorist organisations, namely the Nationalist Socialist Order, Sonnenkrieg Division and the Base as designated terrorist entities. This should not be taken to mean that any person who holds anti-government or other grievances is viewed as committing terrorism offences. There has been significant commentary in Australia and around the world regarding anti-government protests that in the majority have been peaceful. While there may have been a minority of individuals involved in these protests that have held IMVE views, these protests have by and large been a combination of individuals who hold a wide variety of anti-government views, where behaviour has remained largely peaceful, or where there have been instances of public disorder. These have been responded to quickly by our state and territory police. The threat of terrorism has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that. We witnessed how the social restrictions of the pandemic saw individuals and groups espousing anti-government and anti-vaccination sentiment and created opportunities for extremist groups to present their ideologies as solutions to isolated, frustrated and vulnerable communities. The pandemic also saw a significant increase in reliance on the online environment to allow individuals to remain connected. Unfortunately, this also allowed violent extremists to exploit the online arena to amplify their impact through the spreading of propaganda, including politically motivated violence and the radicalisation and recruitment of vulnerable individuals. This led us to see an increase in the radicalisation of some of our most vulnerable members in our community, our young people. We are witnessing a significant decrease in the age of youth involved in terrorism-related activity, with children, as I said, as young as 12 being radicalised. Of particular concern to the AFP is the activity identified online, as well as in the real-world environment, including violence in schools, planning for possible attacks on other students and teachers, including the production of explosives. We're also seeing extremist group members and associates accessing popular online games in a bid to recruit and radicalise young Australians. We've identified the use of online gaming platforms by both religiously and ideologically motivated violent extremist groups who are encouraging extremist ideologies and exposing youth to dangerous content, including violent recreations of actual terrorist events and abhorrent violence against others. Our investigations have revealed these young people hold RMVE, IMVE, or indeed a mixed or unclear ideology, which is influenced by other contributing factors. Some of the commonalities that have been identified across these radicalised youths include neurodiversity, such as autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, family circumstances such as absentee parents, family dysfunctions, and trauma. We find many of these youths socially isolated, have been subject to bullying and looking for inclusion, belonging or purpose. These factors are compounded by the normal vulnerabilities of youth and adolescent development. We are seeing vulnerable and isolated youth being radicalised through high levels of exposure and access to online extremist material, and we continue to expand our investigative focus in this domain to assist partners in various prevention efforts, early intervention mechanisms, and diversion processes when engaging youth. It is not the role of the AFP to provide non-law enforcement therapeutic treatment options to radicalised youth, so we work very closely with our state and territory support services who are responsible for providing that wraparound support services to the impacted youths. As an example, we recently conducted an investigation into a young 20-year-old male who resided in a rural location, had affiliations with known IMVE extremist groups, and was in communication through encrypted chat groups with dozens of other members around the world. In these groups and others, he was observed discussing carrying out a mass killing, posting about live streaming a shooting, advocating for the killing of non-whites, requesting assistance and exchanging material for bomb making, and suggesting the targeting of high-profile enemies, including former heads of state. He also praised and was inspired by previous right-wing mass shooters who had committed attacks offshore. This young male was disrupted through overt police action and successfully prosecuted. On closer examination, this youth had been diagnosed with mild autism spectrum disorder, was socially isolated and had learning difficulties. Concerns held regarding his interest in bomb making and threats of physical violence to students and peers at school had been reported to police. This young male was also posting online for others to commit a terrorist attack in support of Islamic State and was looking for guidance from others offshore. In addition to the JCTT investigation, there were other support arrangements put in place for the young male, including a countering violent extremism program, religious mentoring, psychological treatment, and attempts to divert him from violence. In such cases, the primary concern remains the ability of police, parents and schools to connect with disengaged and at-risk youth. A number of sectors play critical roles in the lives of young people who may be vulnerable to radicalisation, including education, community organisations, child protection, youth justice, mental health and law enforcement. Unfortunately, in this case, despite the significant engagement and treatments from the support services, we were not able to mitigate the risks of this escalating behaviour through non-law enforcement action, and he was arrested. The investigation of this young male is reflective of many other similar counter-terrorism operations and the nature of the threat that we are seeking to address. Threat identification is particularly difficult in the online environment, with the need to assess what are genuine threats, whether it be through their own potential for violence or the intended incitement of others. We attempt to prevent and disrupt these individuals at an early stage, noting that an arrest and charge and exposure to the criminal justice system is not in their long-term interest and is not the best outcome. This challenge is illustrative of the threat and the complexities for the JCTTs and whole of government partners in seeking a proportionate police response to support and divert these youths rather than arrest and charge if possible. Of course, all the while protecting the community from the serious harm. So how are these trends being reflected in the AFP Counter-Terrorism Command workload? And I'm desperately running out of time here. So since January 2020, there's been a significant ongoing effort to maintain the safety of Australian public, and in that time, we've seen 4 major CT disruptions and 5 terrorist acts. Additionally, there have been a range of other people charged with terrorism and other offences disrupted at an early stage. And I'll just finish off, because I am running out of time, just by briefly touching. In March 2021, the AFP created an additional CT policing stream. We established the Enduring Risk Investigations element of the CTSI command. Enduring risk investigations are responsible for the management of high-risk terrorist offenders released into the community after incarceration and the risks that these individuals continue to present to the community. Like many of our international partners, Australia is adapting to managing this risk and the risk posed by these convicted offenders being released into the community following a period of incarceration. The high-risk terrorist offender, or HARTO cohort, is an ever-increasing group who will require constant and ongoing management for many years to come. Through Australia's terrorism legislation, the AFP has a suite of post-sentence measures available for consideration, including continuing detention orders, extended supervision orders and control orders designed to mitigate the risks posed by HARTOs. Managing the enduring risk within the community requires significant effort across all policing capabilities to ensure compliance and enforcement. Many of the released offenders to date have positively reintegrated into the community and are no longer subject to any post-sentence orders. However, what is alarming is that the AFP has charged 10 individuals for breaching their post-sentence orders. In one circumstance, we saw an individual breach their control order within days through their online access to extremist material. This really reinforces the importance of the management of offenders post their release. Notably in Australia, where we are yet to really fully understand the full extent of the risk posed by most of our serious terrorist offenders, as the majority are still serving their custodial sentence. And I will just wrap up there in conclusion, because I've gone over time. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I'd like to commend the extensive work that's gone into organising this conference, and I personally thank each and every one of you for being here today. The increasing complex and diversified caseload of counter-terrorism investigations within Australia has demonstrated that the terrorism threat has definitely not abated. To remain successful, the AFP heavily relies on our partnerships with the community, our domestic and international colleagues, and the private sector, given the emerging prevalence of youth and the threats that the online environment poses. The AFP continues to work hand in hand with our state and territory, international and intelligence partners each and every day to ensure the continued safety of all Australians. Thank you.